All right. Hey, I'm Kimberly Dark, and this is the Hope Desk. And I am here to give you some information from your friendly neighborhood sociologist. I just want to say I don't have all the answers. I don't even have the only right answers, but I'll spend up to an hour each month here doing what I can to address a few issues that folks have told me they struggle with regarding social inequalities. And why are we doing this? Because I think it's hopeful when people know at least enough about a topic to engage in public conversation about it. And there's a whole lot happening in the world, right? I'm not here to offer you in depth scholarship on these topics. Usually, I'll give you a few resources to read more in the chat box as we go. Emily will provide you some links as we go along. But look, sociologists have perspective on the architecture of everyday life that can sometimes be helpful. So I'm here to do my small part. So we're talking today about reparations and about the land back movement. Hashtag land back is a thing that you can look up and follow if you'd like. So just to get started in this way, Emily's going to share a link with you. If you would like, you can look up your, what land you are on, because if you live in the United States or in Canada, well, or a lot of North America, then you are on unceded land probably, and so you can put that in your name, just like I have done, by hovering your cursor over the little three dots at the corner of your picture in the top right, and then click rename, and you can see that there. So you can see that I am speaking to you today from occupied Hawaii. I'm using the word occupied there because Hawaii is still the name of the place that that the native people who live here use as well. So that is your first option, and I think I'm going to talk about reparations first. So hey, here's the thing about reparations. I feel like I always go back about three steps before we start the conversation. So we all know that there was a really terrible and yet expansive time in European history when folks went about stealing and killing and settling down. And this happened, a lot of the countries of Europe went out into the world and settled places that already had people living in them. So I just want to point out, like, this is not the first time in the history of humans that people have gone and settled and taken over and raped and pillaged and killed and settled in. But it was a hugely expansive time because of travel by sea had become a much bigger deal than it had been before. So listen, this is probably familiar to you, but I'm starting here because it is important to acknowledge that even though we can think about this time in history and go, right, that wasn't a great thing, right? That people went and, tried to infect people with disease in order to clear land, or like in Australia, actually declared the land free of humans, right? Even though Aboriginal people were living there already. We can look back now and say that wasn't a great thing, but what do we actually do with that knowledge? That has varied globally from country to country. And as usual, I'm talking mostly about the United States, but I think that it's relevant to talk a little bit about Canada as well. I mean, I know a thimbleful, but because many of the indigenous folks in the US, we're not using the same borders that we use now. So it is true in the United States that Black and Indigenous people have not had equality and that their suffering has not been fully acknowledged. And I want to say, yes, absolutely, other groups have been wronged in the course of the history of the United States. And wrongs can be righted, but we haven't gotten around to that yet. There are two very specific groups, Black and Indigenous people, who have a specific kind of history of wrong done against them that we really can look to repair very specifically, right? So, in the case of indigenous people who lost the sovereignty of their land and their connection, their ability to steward that land, that is one thing. And then, of course, Black people who were brought to the United States as slaves and in chattel slavery, which means intergenerationally, did not have a designation of human, right? Their humanity was actually ignored. This is another situation that we have yet to deal with. And so, yes, we mostly talk about reparations in the United States with regard to African American people, the descendants of former slaves. But I'm going to talk about reparations in general. And as we go along, I might use some other examples too that hopefully make it clear that reparations can have broader applications. Because just remember that the root word there at reparations, this is about repair. This is about how is it possible to repair history in such a way that it creates a greater sense of community and connection and an ability to move forward today. That's actually what we're talking about, the concept of repair. All right. So there is an article that Emily can share with you from the Morningside Center about reparations. And I have specifically chosen to share an article with you, which you can look out later if you paste it into something, that is targeted to educators. First of all, I respect the work of the Morningside Center, and um, this information is targeted towards educators, and I want to share that with you because the point of the help desk is to figure out how do you have these conversations more broadly, than just with me, right? We have to figure out how to talk about these things, and so tools for educators might be really useful to you. So let me just comment about 5 forms of reparations. You might not have thought this through before, and this list of 5 forms of reparations comes from the United Nations Development Program on Reparations, Development, and Gender. These folks put this together in 2010. Like I said, around the world, people have to deal with this sort of thing, and also across cultures, folks have to deal with the idea of how does repair take place. So, according to the UN and these 5 forms of reparations, one of them is restitution, which would be a restoration of a victim's rights or property or citizenship status. So, for instance, if somebody is known to be wrongly imprisoned, you might be able to restore that victim's rights or property or citizenship status. If, for instance, as happened in the U.S. with Japanese people, if a group is interned, then again imprisoned, right, by the government in this case for no wrongdoing, there might be restitution. So check it out. This is trickier when we talk about slavery because we're talking about a group of people who were not accorded human status in the first place when they were brought to the U.S. And so restitution is a little harder in that case, since the original condition, legally at least, was that this is a group that can be enslaved partially because we don't recognize their humanity. All right, second form of reparation is rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is focused on psychological or physical support. Of course, this only works if there is some group that is able to reasonably provide psychological or physical support, given that there's a long history of help not actually being helpful or not actually coming from a place of humanity or love. So rehabilitation would be the second of 5 forms of reparations. The third is simple enough: compensation, cash. Here you go. Here is compensation. And I have to tell you, in trying to learn a bit more about some of these discussions, I have long talked about how reparations in terms of the 40 acres and a mule promise, which happened in the United States, and was a way that settlement and Western expansion took place. But of course, Black people were not given 40 acres and a mule. And I've often joked about, couldn't we go back to that? I mean, there would be a great demand for mules all of a sudden, but couldn't we go back to that? Thinking, well, it turns out actually that some of the House of Representatives discussions that are happening right now around reparations are focused on not the mule. Okay, they're not talking about the mule, but focused on that as a trope for, what would the 40 acres and a mule be worth today if we decided to re-equalize that situation. So compensation is number 3. Number 4 is called satisfaction. Now, what that means is an acknowledgement of guilt, apology, um, appropriate burials, construction of memorials. So you may be aware in the United States that we're still in the process of tearing down memorials or replacing them in like museums so that their historical context is noted, of memorials to um, slave owners and the people who were in charge of operating slave owning states and parts of the US. So, wow, we're kind of a long way from being able to move toward this satisfaction form of reparation. And then the 5th form is guarantees of non repetition. So, a reformation of laws and civil and political structures that led to or fueled violence. That would be what a guarantee of non-reparation would look like. So there are loads, if we go back to this idea of reparations for the descendants of slaves in the United States, there are loads of ways that people have been discussing this. I'm going to just offer you the name of William A. Darity, who is a reparations scholar, and you could look him up online. And so some people have talked about direct dependence, direct payments to descendants of formerly enslaved folks. And some people, again, are talking about that 40 acres and a mule, which, we're talking about a lot of money. And also, I just want to be very careful here because these kind of reparations are not likely to happen unless they are accompanied by a change in mindset. And also, they are likely to be symbolic unless they are accompanied by a change in mindset about responsibility for the wealth divide, right, that exists in the United States between Black and white in particular. We could look more closely at white folks and everyone else, other people of color as well. But just to make sure we're on the same page here regarding that kind of history, like what are we talking about? I'm going to share screen real fast and show you this little infographic that we created, my assistant and I created some time ago. Obviously, this is not complete, and but the point that I would like to make to you is that Black wealth suppression in the United States has a long history, and part of that long history has to do with the fact that, hey, when slaves were freed, first of all, the government paid reparations to those slave owners, but nothing to the people who had been enslaved. Now, why would that be? I'm going to suggest to you that the reason is because that was a giant leap all of a sudden for those slave owners to go from owning human beings one day and not considering their full humanity to suddenly saying, oh, yeah, not only do you have humanity, you are equal to me. I mean, think about that for a moment. This is why it is very important when we look at restorations that we look at the process of how do we rehumanize one another. And so South Africa has, has been held up sometimes as an example with the Truth and Reparation, Truth and Reconciliation Project, um, and part of that project was some financial payments, but a big part of it also was trying to help white South Africans understand what actually were the living conditions of Black and South Africans of color in that country. And also, what was the role of white complicity, right? What was the role of people being able to turn their head from the horrific things that were happening? So, this is the sort of thing that we need to have in the United States as well, in my opinion. So, Black wealth suppression, and maybe we can figure out actually how to share this. I'll figure out how to share this infographic with you as well. It is definitely on my Facebook page. I'll make sure it is reshared on my Facebook page if you would like to look at it further. Okay, I've just talked blah, blah, blah quite a bit about some definitions of reparations, and I would like to know if anybody has questions or comments about what I have said so far.
Everyone is free to unmute themselves and,
Thank you, Emily.
and speak.
I mean, you don't have to, of course. There is no requirement to speak.
Who was that guy, William A? When you gave us a reference, guarantees of
I
non-repetition.
did. Yes, yes. Darity, Darity, is a reparations scholar whose work you could look at some more. See, we're in this interesting moment because, well, look, we're always in an interesting moment, aren't we? I mean, I don't know. I don't know how we move from talking to action with some of these things. But in 2020, members of Congress looked at HR 40 is a commission to study reparations. And so that is at least happening. Now, how we move from talking to action, I don't know. But as I've already mentioned, I think that it's useful to think about those 5 types of reparations, because unless we can move through a truer understanding of the differences, and for goodness sakes, thank you, Black Lives Matter movement, because we're inching closer, like this last summer where all of a sudden there was an explosion of books about Black lives became bestsellers. Are people reading the books? I don't know. I mean, yes, there seem to be book clubs and all of that happening. Is action being taken that would move toward repair? That's the question. That's the question. And I think we need to, rather than making reparations a bad word about, deciding who deserves what, if we stick with the word repair and hew close to the idea that serious damage was done in the founding of our nation and for hundreds of years afterward, and that any kind of benefit white people have is based on white supremacy, right? You can have a terrible, unlucky, bad life, but if you're white, race is not part of it, right? So privilege is not about having things. It is about what you don't have to deal with, which is racial bias. So until we can get to a clear understanding of that, I'm not sure we can get to actual repair, which is hopefully where we're headed. All right. Anything right now that needs to be addressed before I move on to talk about land back a little bit, which is a form of reparation? All right. Off I go. Emily can share another link with you, which I hope you choose to look at a little bit later. This is a wonderful link about Well, it's the resourcegeneration.org, and it's about land reparations, indigenous solidarity. It's an action guide, but one of the things that it contains that I would hope you have a look at are examples of how this is already working in different parts of the United States and Canada. So there is the land back movement in Canada right now is impressing the heck out of me. It is a strong movement in Canada, and uh, I don't know a lot about Canadian history. You know, I know less about Canadian history than about in the U.S. But again, it is important to be looking at North America as a whole when we talk about land back, because Canada, the U.S., and Mexico all had indigenous people who were displaced or certainly disempowered, right? So let me just say this about the land back movement in Canada. Um, so in Canada, apparently, you know, when Indigenous nations entered into treaties with the Queen, they never intended to transfer land to Canada. There was never legal consideration from those Indigenous nations, like a land transfer offer. That never happened. Um, so treaties allowed for settlers to occupy lands, and both sides promised to work in harmony and to be peaceful with one another. As in the United States, treaties were stomped on and ignored and torn up, and you know, are still not being followed. And so um, I think this is the case, that Canada actually has some clearer path to uh, sovereignty than we have in the U.S. at the moment. But it is still not a super clear path, and many of the hmm, many of the same insults and injuries that have happened to Indigenous people, such as children being torn from families and sent to residential schools. Many of those things happened in both of our countries. So it's worth learning more about Canada. So here's the thing, super simple. Land back means give the land back. It means, look, those indigenous people still exist, and where they still exist and have tribal identity, it is possible to say, we did wrong, let's give the land back. Now, if this sounds radical to you, I would urge you to think of a few different things. There are some dominant fears about giving the land back, and they're worth thinking about because they come from a settler colonial mindset. And that is perhaps not the same mindset that we want to continue following as a nation. And it is certainly not the same mindset that most Indigenous people follow themselves. So, one of the big fears about land back, and by the way, because I live in occupied Hawaii, I am a fan of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. I think it would take a lot of work, but I think that, you know, people are fully capable of stewarding their own land. So, one of the big things that comes up is, but wait, if you give the land back, then what? Do we have to go back to Europe? Do we get kicked off the land? Do we have to give up our homes? We have to, how does that work? So check it out. This is a settler colonial mindset, isn't it? The idea that the land would then be owned by someone else and you would have no right to live or tread upon it is definitely not an indigenous mindset. So if for instance, Hawaiian sovereignty became true, I would be an immigrant to a sovereign country and I would abide by the rules of that place. And there would probably be certain rules for immigrants, as there are in most countries. Would it mean that I would have to pack up and go? Well, according to most of the Hawaiian sovereignty folks that I have heard from, no, that would not be the case. There would be different rules to abide by because there would be a different group of people stewarding the land and resources of this place. So the same might be true for other places in North America, where you know, people would have this question about, well, so was that? Do I have to leave? Well, I don't know. How are you acting? How are you acting? Are you acting like you are happy to be part of a community that has perhaps different values than you do? Uh, and chances are you would not be kicked out of your house and off of your land. There would be some recognition there because of a different mindset toward what it means to steward land as opposed to own it. Um, there is also the question of, if land is returned to tribal governance, what if they make decisions you don't agree with? Chances are they would. And that again would be a question of, if you were an immigrant to another country, you would be living under the rules of those, those who provide governance in that place. Um, so chances are there would be some mechanism in place for you to provide your input, for you to be a meaningful and active part of your community. It may or may not include an ability to be part of the governance, but how would you relate to that? So that becomes another question. Then there would also be the question of having decisions made that do not benefit or support you specifically. And again, this is coming from a settler colonial mindset, the idea that you can go to another place and expect that decisions are going to be made to support your desires and your life. And folks, a lot of these questions, I'm targeting the idea of settler colonial mindset, but they also come from white supremacy and the foothold and stronghold that white supremacist thinking has in our nation. So this comes down to the question of what belongs to you and what you have rights to. So one of the things, for instance, you will find in that list of examples that I've given you is a cash gift. A woman received an inheritance, and she realized, wow, this inheritance comes to me because the Ute people in Utah were had their resources taken from them by my ancestors, and so why don't I just give this money back? So that really, and she's like, this just makes sense. And I agree with her, but it also requires an individual to say, what does it mean that something belongs to me? What does that mean? Especially when it comes to inheritance. Might even be with how you have made money yourself in this life, if exploitation has been involved. But often we are talking about inheritance. So these are things to consider when we think about land back. Ceding literal land back is, of course, another way to look at this. But hashtag land back, join that on Instagram, or on, if you follow that on Instagram, on Twitter, Facebook, you will have some more education on these things as well. Is there anything that I've said so far that requires further illumination, or questions that you would like to ask?
I have a question.
Yes.
So is Canada currently doing that right now? They're giving their land back to them?
Well, in small pockets, yes, in small pockets. So I believe that it is still true that indigenous land, indigenously stewarded land, is only about 0.2% of the whole Canadian land mass, right? I mean, it's a giant country, but 0.2% is pretty small in terms of stewardship. So yes, there is a land back movement that is happening in Canada and in the U.S., and I don't know about Mexico, but it is still a small movement, and requires more people. Again, because we're talking about repair, it requires more people to be thinking about and talking about and on board with what does it mean to actually repair a relationship that exists, right? Like in the United States, for instance, we've got a two-party political system that is very much at odds right now. And so what does it actually mean for people to learn to coexist without terrorizing, traditionally oppressed groups, right? What does it mean? Because, unity, when one side is talking about, continuing to curtail the rights of certain populations, unity may not be possible under those circumstances, right? So we have to bring all of this into conversation with an eye toward repair.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, I think Peggy, you're talking, but
um, when we talk about repairing, repairing, it seems weird to me that a committee in Congress is making decisions or even looking into how are we going to repair our relationships with Black people, or whatever group it is. I mean, it seems to me that it would work maybe by inviting people in to how can white people repair relationships.
okay, so let me see if I follow what you're saying here. I think that it only seems strange for Congress to be dealing with this because Congress is not yet a racially integrated body, right? And so when you are talking about Congress thinking this through, you're thinking about a group of white people trying to figure out, right? But there's another way to frame this, perhaps. If we think about the US government trying to repair its previously murderous policies against Black people in specific, perhaps people of color in general, that's a different conversation and a different question. And absolutely, we ought to be moving toward a representative government. That is one part of the problem with with why we need repair, is that we do not have yet a representative government, even though some wonderful folks have been elected to office who are representing their constituency, but also have the experiences of their embodied racial gender groups. So I think that when a House committee is convened such as this, it is not a group of elected officials that are trying to make those decisions on their own. It is a group that is calling in experts such as Darity, who I just mentioned. But you're absolutely right. It is symbolic at best if there is not adequate representation in the government that is trying to make the repair that looks to equalize opportunities and circumstances.
And then one more point I'd like to make. I also believe that it's symbolic at best if there isn't some ongoing opportunity for these white men to learn about white supremacy. And
Oh, yes.
I would like to hear that there's something like that going on. And I'd like to hear that going on. I mean, I think that's where we can really, really make movement. If even kids in high school were learning, if white supremacy was one of the classes, or
Yeah. Well, and this is part of what we have perhaps to learn from the model of the Truth and Reconciliation Project in South Africa and other examples as well. In the resources that I've shared with you, there's some other examples too. But yeah, I would say that those things have to be happening either before or concurrent with any kind of meaningful substantive reparations. Otherwise they simply won't, first of all, they simply won't succeed. Or if they did, they would be nominal, kind of like how a corporation says, oh, well, we're going to focus on diversity and inclusion, which of course is meaningless unless the environment is changed to actually honor diversity and to and to question diverse from what? Well, right, inclusive of whom? Because that still is holding whiteness central to say we're interested in diversity and inclusion. Ooh. So, so we have to move beyond, that kind of rhetoric for sure. Thank you, Peggy. Anyone else have comments before I ask you my next question?
I have a comment. I have a
Yes.
friend who's in grad school, another Jewish woman my age. We're both in our late 40s, and sorry, something just fell outside. And she is in grad school, and she's studying indigenous studies and learning about all this stuff. And Peggy just called out white men in particular, and she and I the other day were talking about like as Jewish women, what is our role and responsibility, like as diasporic people without a homeland, like just sort of like acknowledging the tension between being white and being Jewish diasporic, against Israel, like not an anti-Zionist diasporic Jews. Like, where do we go when we open? If we're pro reparations and pro, giving back the land to the indigenous peoples from whom Americans stole it, like, what does a Jew do? Right? We're like, I felt safe. We feel safe with each other having this conversation. And she said, some indigenous people have said, here's what you do. You go to the West Coast or the East Coast, and there's a plank set up at the end of each of these coasts, and you can just get on it and start walking. Like, basically, that's not the right question to ask. We always have to prioritize the struggles of those less powerful than we are. But
so listen, there's a couple of things that come up for me in the scenario that you've just described. One of them is that there is still a centering of the settler colonial mindset that giving land back, giving stewardship back to its original inhabitants is going to displace somebody. Now, chances are, for most people living in their little house and shopping at their market and, working at their job, that's not the case. Nobody is suggesting a purging of the continent. Nobody is suggesting a purging of, so that is in and of itself a settler colonial mindset to say, well, so then where do I go? Right? Well, you stay where you are and you find out what are the priorities of the folks who now steward the land that you live on. That's the answer to that. Right? It's not where do I go?
right.
It's, how do I then relate to what this land now means? And there's a tricky thing here, I think, and Jewish people are not the only ones that that deal with this. Like, United States has had layers upon layers of immigrants, layers and layers of immigrants, many of whom have been treated terribly. And if they were not able to be redefined as white, so think about this, right? Chinese people come, they were never redefined as white, but Italian people came and they were redefined as white, right? So white supremacy ended up benefiting some immigrants and didn't end up benefiting other immigrants. So there's and one could argue that Jewish people have received some of the benefits of whiteness and also not. You could argue that in both directions. So I think that part of what the idea of reparations requires of us is to be actively in inquiry about all of these things, to be actively discussing what does this mean and to whom, and why are these people getting to decide and these people aren't, and what is happening here. These are the conversations that we have not adequately had in the United States. And I just want to point out to you that in many other countries, Canada is one of them. I'll tell you, I have been a person who idealizes Canada, and the fact that they're kind of botching up this indigenous issue right now in a terrible way, um, that is helping to fuel the land back movement in Canada. I mean, my goodness, we're setting a low bar here, and they're kind of meeting it. So uh, Canada had at least acknowledged and provided some reparations for people who were sent to residential schools. Um, Similarly, in Australia now, of course, white supremacy looks different in all of our countries, but there are certain countries that are at least further along than the United States and providing examples for how we can at least have these conversations, frame these conversations, and take the next steps, whatever those next steps happen to be. So here's my question for you, which I try and ask you in every Hope Desk. Where do you think you might have these conversations? Where do you think in your life you might be able to talk about reparations or hashtag land back next? Is there anywhere that you can envision yourself discussing these things? If somebody would unmute and, just give an example.
Well, I think certainly in my family, which is,
Thank you.
not really a scary place to do it in my family.
Thank you.
And we also talk about it in the Allies of Black Lives Matter Sacramento group.
That's beautiful. Those are two beautiful, and you're right, low stakes scenarios to have these discussions in. So folks, I encourage you to think about what are low stakes ways to have these conversations, and then periodically find a higher stakes setting for a conversation as well. Obviously taking into account your safety and reasonable comfort. Any other suggestions for where you might talk about this stuff?
I can answer.
Thank you.
So for me, I don't really talk to people a lot about like social issues, but when I feel certainly like something about something, like I'll see it on social media, and so I'll post about it and like say what I think is right and stuff like that. And so it is good to like have, like how do you said, like information to back up, because a lot of times I'm like, oh, like I might want to post this, like the indigenous people in their land has come up before on social media. And so I'm like, oh, I do want to post it, but like, what if someone asks me questions and I don't know about it? But like, it's something that, that I want to know more knowledge about. So I guess you could say like social media is a platform of having these conversations too.
Excellent choice. Social media is absolutely a platform where you can have these conversations, and it's a fairly low stakes one. Maybe not quite as low stakes as one's family, well, depending on your family, of course. But because social media does open you to potential ridicule by others, but this is a good place where people have these kind of conversations. And for instance, the infographic that I shared, if you look to my Facebook page and copy that infographic, you're going to see that it's shareable. And those are ways to start conversations as well on social media. Anywhere else that you might think of to share some of these topics, right? To engage these topics with others. Those are a fine start for sure. And also, if someone else brings up these topics, for instance, at work, at the bus stop, at the community meeting, hopefully you have at least a little bit of understanding of how to get into that conversation and offer your own perspectives, because we are literally creating the world even as it creates us. There is no part of human culture that is not created by humans. And that means that each of us has a responsibility, but also a right. We have the right to influence culture. And my goodness, there are some folks that are not, are kind of hateful, who are out doing their darndest to influence the culture. And so I think that if you've got a mind toward fairness and equity and compassion, it's time for us to do that work as well.